Well, what's really emerged over the last few years is that biodiversity loss can be a material financial issue for companies, really because of two things. Firstly, companies are exposed to risk and opportunity through the impacts that they have on biodiversity, but also businesses are wholly dependent on ecosystem services to a greater or lesser degree. So companies really need to tackle these things. In early days, people thought those came for free. Now companies realize that they don't, and they're getting much more sophisticated at looking at how this will play out for them in terms of risk and opportunity. Actually, there have been lots. I think I'll single out two to mention to you. The first is really encouraging that there's much more expectation that companies show rigor on the application of the mitigation hierarchy, so avoid, minimize, restore, and finally demonstrate no net loss. And we're seeing that because there's more regulation on the subject and because there's increasing financial requirements for companies. The IFC has just released revised performance standards for all project finance from its clients. As of the 1st of January, both the IFC and about 73 banks that espouse the Equator Principles will now only lend project finance to companies that demonstrate no net loss of biodiversity where those clients have an impact on natural habitat, where that's feasible, and they'll require a net gain of biodiversity from those clients that have an impact on critical habitat. So that's great. The other development that I would mention would be natural capital accounting. It was great to hear that at Rio, some 57 governments and some 75 companies have committed to some kind of natural capital accounting. I think that will really help. I think there's three levels of involvement that will help us to scale up. The first is that companies are constantly calling, and we heard that this morning, for an enabling policy framework. They need the policy clarity to incentivize long-term investments. So that's really important. The second major area of an enabling policy framework is really finance, the conditions of finance. The new requirements for project finance, according to Performance Standard 6 of the IFC, that require no net loss or a net gain, is really important, and that's espoused now by all the members of the Equator Principles. If we can see that moving beyond project finance to mergers and acquisitions and all the other areas of finance, that would be fantastic. And then of course we've just talked about enabling conditions through policy and finance, but there's a lot of room for companies themselves to demonstrate leadership. For example, reporting on natural capital. That would be great. Using profit and loss accounts like Puma's one on environment would be a brilliant move in the right direction. Well, one of the developments that we've seen over the last few years is an increasing use of partnerships by companies with NGOs. Of course, there's a very broad ecosystem of NGOs, those that work very closely with companies and those that take a rather different attitude to companies, and there's a role for all of them in civil society, I think. But partnerships can really help because companies don't necessarily have the scientific skills to work on biodiversity and ecosystem services on the ground, and it's useful for them to have those scientific experts and to reach out to civil society and form these partnerships. Another role that NGOs can play is to help with monitoring and evaluation. It's very important that the fine words of companies with their corporate commitments are actually measured and monitored in practice, and that can be done very well by NGOs. I've long been passionate about these issues, in fact since I was a small girl. I was very lucky to be on the team of the original Rio Earth Summit in the run-up to 1992, so I can afford to be a little nostalgic now. I'm just very convinced that the quality of life for all of us and the beauty of the world as we know it will rest on strides forward on environment and development. I think Gro Harlem Brundtland had it right in 1987, and in the intervening years we've seen a lot of trends that are not very encouraging. There's a great deal of innovation that's marvellous, but we really need to step up and make these changes, and to the extent I can play a part in that, I'd like to do so. The Business and Biodiversity Offsets Programme is a consortium of about 82 companies, government agencies, NGOs and financial institutions from around the world. And we've now been working together for the better part of 7 or 8 years. And our goal has been to explore no net loss of biodiversity and how you can deliver that on the ground. The first thing we did was to develop a set of principles that all the member organisations could agree to, that really stress following the mitigation hierarchy of avoid, minimise, restore, and only dealing with offsets as a last resort, but a really important one to show that you achieve no net loss. And we made this possible by trying it out in practice with a number of companies with pilot projects on the ground. Initially, we've worked largely with mining and oil and gas companies. Now we're starting to turn to agriculture and tourism and other sectors. There have been a number of handbooks that give people very practical tools on how to do this. And in January of this year, I'm really happy to say that we released a standard on biodiversity offsets. It's quite a complicated area, and companies find themselves investing quite a bit in following this mitigation hierarchy, and they really need something that is trustworthy and reliable as a framework that they can use to report on how they've gone about achieving no net loss, so that their stakeholders, whether that's investors or governments or NGOs, can feel confident that they've taken appropriate steps. I hope we can encourage businesses here to see that actually we already know the direction to go in, and we have a number of very practical tools that can be deployed. And if we can show them some good examples where those tools are being used and encourage them to scale up so we can really get this mainstreamed into economic decision making, that would be fantastic.